Good evening, everybody. Well, hopefully you can all see my screen okay, because I've got some good pictures to share with you this evening. I imagine that most of you have actually seen photographs of the mosaic on the news, which, you know, it's just absolutely wonderful, really, but there's so much more to the site. So I'm going to try and put the mosaic into some kind of context for you. So I'll be talking a little bit about the background to the site. I'm going to discuss the evidence that we've got so far and what we know about the layout of the site. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time looking at the mosaic itself. And finally, have a look at what happened in the later history of the site. I've got a few caveats to start with. As Pete has already said, it's very, very early days. I mean, we only actually came off site at the beginning of October. And as we progress through the post-excavation work, we're bound to discover new details. You know, we'll be revising our original opinions, no doubt, and making new interpretations. So don't be a bit surprised if you see another talk in a year or two that does not agree with everything that I'm going to say here. Hopefully it'll agree with something I'm going to say here, but yes, there are bound to be changes as we go through this this process. The other point that I'd like to make right at the start is that although I'm doing the talking today, this has been very, very much a team effort. I mean, all archaeology is, but what I'm going to talk about today is drawn from discussions with excavators and scholars who include David Neal, who is you know, a renowned expert on mosaics and a very fine artist. Jeremy Taylor, he's a lecturer at the University of Leicester, and you know, he knows pretty much everything there is to know about Roman stuff. John Thomas, my manager, Jane Massilia, and last but not least, the wonderful Pete Liddle, who has been there throughout this process. You're probably about thinking now that it's time for me to just get on with it, so I will. Let's go to the first slide. You just bear with, I seem to be having a bit of trouble. Oh, there we go. Okay, we're at the first slide. Right, so we're going back to the beginning then, at the discovery. So Jim Irvine's dad, Brian, farms the land where the villa was found. Now, during lockdown, Jim was walking the field and discovered some pottery. He was very intrigued by it and went on Google Earth, actually, where he noticed some crop marks suggesting that there was a building in the field. Well, he was so intrigued that he went back with a spade one hot August afternoon and uncovered part of a mosaic. And not just any old mosaic either, but there were figures on it. So Jim reported the find to the local authorities, and then everybody started to get very, very excited. And Historic England, who many of you will know are the public body responsible for heritage, funded a small excavation to investigate this new site and assess its state of preservation. So my first encounter with the mosaic was at that point when I was lucky enough to be chosen to lead the excavation. It's certainly fair to say that I was pretty blown away by it. I'd never seen anything like it before. The colours, the style, you just kind of fall in love with it, really. So my job on that occasion was to supervise the careful recording of the exposed archaeology and gathering all the information that I could, and then to protect and backfill the mosaic. So I was very ably assisted by Pete and Debbie Frierson as well, and Jim, and David Neal came to draw and to paint the exposed mosaic. Now, it was pretty clear early on that this was a site that we might wish to, you know, might really need the protection of scheduling. So Historic England wanted to find out a bit more information about it so that they you know, knew exactly what we were dealing with. It was obvious that the mosaic was part of a wider set of rooms and buildings. So a geophysical survey was commissioned, and that was from Sumo, to explore the whole field. Now, the technique worked really well. Oh, hang on, this is the first excavation. I'll just let you appreciate those photographs of all the work going on, and just what a sort of wonderful privilege it was actually to work on it. So that's brilliant. We've got, yes, there's Pete down on his hands and knees cleaning the mosaic, and Jim also giving that floor a good wash. And you can also see David doing his drawing there. And that's me surveying, very important surveying. Right, okay, so let's come back to the geophysics then. So this plot that you can see here is magnetometry. And as you can see, it worked rather well. So magnetometry is very well used in archaeology. It's quite a rapid technique, and it detects and maps variations in magnetic response under the ground surface and compares it with a sort of background response. So all these areas of variation are known as magnetic anomalies. And although they can have many causes, they can also indicate buried archaeological features. So anomalies were detected across the area, and you can see all these patterns here. So we've broadly got quite a few linear responses, which are representing ditches, and also areas of increased or decreased magnetic response, which indicate structures and associated settlement features. So I'm hoping you're going to be able to see my cursor moving around here. What we've got two parallel ditch anomalies, which are curving round here, and they are actually echoing the edge of the high ground above a river. Probably the most striking feature of this plot are the multiple parallel linear responses, these set of ditches here, which seem to form a boundary around the central area. And then in the middle here, we've got what really at this stage looks like quite a jumble in a way, but that is kind of showing us where there's lots of other archaeological features, the buildings, the halves, possibly kilns, all sorts of things really. And these are mainly located on the higher ground. These rather blobby bits at the bottom are responses that indicate colluvium and alluvium. So, that's actually where your signal's almost a little bit obscured, really. Now, you'll see that I've got some little ditch sections here around the edge because we explored some of the peripheral features. And this is the kind of thing that we found. So we were getting ditches that were, perhaps 2, 3, 4 meters in width, and at least a meter deep still surviving, often with several different backfills and recuts. Some sections have very few finds, while others are absolutely chock full of pot and bones. And some of them also have a lot of kind of building rubble in the backfill. One rather intriguing thing we found, though, was a human burial. And we found that between these ditches at the top. Now, at that time, we were not able to excavate that burial, so we don't know the date of it yet, but just sort of keep it in the back of your mind as we go through the rest of the talk. Okay, so a second geophysical survey was used on areas of particular interest, and this one is a ground penetrating radar survey. Now, this is a technique that works differently. It emits a pulse into the ground and records the reflections that result from objects under the surface. It works particularly well on structures and solid objects, but perhaps less so on ditches. So if I get my cursor again and try and show you, there we go. You can just see how much fainter those ditch responses are there, but you can just about make them out. But what it really, really shows up well is all of these buildings. I mean, there's kind of no mistaking what we're looking at here. There's a whole range of buildings on this site. So, to be honest, we were absolutely stunned when this survey came back, because all of a sudden, you've got a plan. You've got a layout of what's happening under the ground, and it really gives you something to work with. Now, we haven't got time to look at everything in this plan, but I thought what would be useful was to have a quick tour of the main buildings that we can see, and then that will help us kind of focus in on the parts that we excavated. So, looking at this one first then, this is the main villa building. So it's in this area that we found the mosaic. And what we can see here are kind of terrifically complex reflections, especially at the southern end of the building. I'm not sure I've got a north arrow on here, but just to let you know, north is actually at the top. Okay, so in this main building, it's so good that we're actually able to identify individual rooms. So it looks like a kind of corridor or double portico type villa. And the mosaic was found in this kind of apse area, this room here, this apsidal room at the north end of the building. Interestingly, with this main villa building, there seem to be ancillary structures at the north and also at the south end. And there's also a whole series of circular structures in and around that building. So there's a range of things that these could be. You know, they could be wells, we could have some stone roundhouses, we could have shrines, and, you know, even possible that we might have a small mausoleum among these remains, because, you know, these are all things that we would probably expect to find on a villa estate like this one. So let's move on and have a look at some other buildings. So we've got these two here. Now, these are large rectangular structures. They've got quite similar dimensions to each other. So they're around 25 meters by 9 meters, or if we're doing this in old money, I think that's about 27 yards by 10 yards, something like that. They're set on different alignments, but at right angles to each other. So this really does suggest that they are contemporary. The eastern building is the most complex, and the GPR suggests that there's at least 4 rooms in there, suggesting that it could be some kind of corridor villa, which is rather interesting if we think about those ditches again, because it's actually pretty much in the centre of these ditches. So, you know, that kind of begs the question of, is this the original villa, and perhaps the one with the mosaic in slightly later? I mean, these are kind of questions that we can't answer without excavation, but it certainly is very interesting. Now, just to the west here, I'm going to point my cursor around this thing here. This is a circular building that may or may not have been contemporary. It could be some kind of roundhouse, and that's going to become important later on, because we do actually investigate part of that. Right, now the simpler plan of this building here, this suggests it's perhaps more agricultural, so it could be some sort of granary, something like that. So moving on. What about this one then? That's really intriguing little structure. And I know if you're anything like me, the first time you see that, you think to yourself, oh, could that be some sort of chapel? That looks, you know, very interesting. But actually, most likely is that this is some kind of detached bathhouse. Now, this is, you know, fairly a form that you do see at other villa sites, this sort of cruciform shape. So that seems likely that that's what that is. But again, we never know till we excavate these things. Okay, so let's move on. Let's move down here. Now, this building is not so clear, so it does not show up so well, and part of the reason for that could be some kind of alluvial cover. So, you know, quite a lot of soils built up over the top. However, it's a very interesting structure. It's relatively close to the river, and it seems to be subdivided at one end, at that western end there. We can see sort of hints of rooms going on, but there's also these what look like perhaps column bases or post pits, something like that. So, you know, again, there could be a bathhouse in this. I mean, I think the magnetometry showed up quite a lot of things that could be HyperCoursed or furnaces or something like that. So yeah, interesting building down there. And then we've got this one, and that is a not dissimilar sort of thing. It's quite similar again in terms of dimensions. So it's about 27 by 10 meters. And once again, we seem to be seeing quite a lot of features inside that building. In some ways, this building here, and this is represented by 2 lines of post pits or post pads, something like that. Now this is really rather intriguing, because it is on a different alignment to many of the other buildings, which has led to the suggestion that could this be something later? Could this be, you know, even something like a Saxon hall? Well, the short answer is yes, it could be. We don't know that, but of course we do also know that the Romans had a lot of aisled buildings. So again, without excavation, we can't assign this to any particular period, but hopefully you will agree that this is quite an amazing collection of buildings which appear to be surviving intact on this one site. And it looks like we really do have the full range that you might expect. So presumably these things have different functions, they may well have a different chronology, and it is very, very possible that these are not all contemporary. The number of known villas in the region, so that's East Leicestershire, Rutland, Northamptonshire, is slowly growing. So a quick search of the area actually produces a wealth of information on Roman settlement and other remains. But I think this villa is particularly important, and that's for several reasons. So for a start, few of the other known villas are actually recent discoveries. So they've either been discovered and investigated in antiquity, others were discovered in the earlier 20th century, and therefore excavation has often been quite patchy. So, many of them were excavated in the middle years of the 20th century, when techniques were probably not so quite well developed as they are today. So things like environmental archaeology, for example, weren't as important back then, whereas now these are things that we do tend to think about quite a lot. And the other thing is that several of these other villa sites have been destroyed as well. So by contrast, this new villa seems to be largely intact, which means that it has major research potential and really is of national and regional significance. So just to emphasize that point, a study a few years ago, I think it was by Smith, showed that of over 75% of known villa sites in the country, we actually know very little about them beyond the main villa buildings. So for that, that's only 25% that we actually know anything about the sort of main the main estate. So this really means that it's resulted in rather patchy plans. They're often lacking in a lot of detail, and we don't really understand the chronologies of these places too well. So in a way, what we're seeing here is quite an important opportunity for targeted research. And I think that could provide a wide range of social, economic and ritual activity across the site. So, really, really very, very exciting indeed, I think. So we're going to move on to look at some excavated parts now. Well, the reason this took place at all was because after some negotiation, we at the University of Leicester managed to put together a proposal for a student field school with our second year students, and that took place in September this year. Now, basically, the students needed field work. I mean, after lockdown last year, they hadn't had the field work that they needed. And of course, we really needed and actually desperately wanted to know more about the site. So this plan here is, well, it shows you the geophysical anomalies and these slightly scruffy looking black outlined trenches here. That's our excavated areas. So we actually looked at 3 different areas. So let's take a closer look at those. Well, why did we choose them? Well, the Mosaic trench, really was fairly straightforward. There were very strong artistic and archaeological reasons to completely expose the mosaic and so enable it to be understood as fully as possible. But it was also really important to try and understand the context of the mosaic, how the room fitted into the northern part of the villa and what was around it. And an important aim, sometimes overlooked in early excavations, was to actually try and clarify what was happening during the decline of the villa. So what was happening in those later years of the site and how did it get to the point of being forgotten under a field? Our second trench, I'm going to call the Northern Annex, because although these trenches all have numbers, as you can see, it becomes a little bit of a mouthful when you're talking about them. So we'll call this one the Northern Annex. So the main idea with this was to try and make sense of this part of the building because it appeared slightly separate from the main villa building. So what was its function and how did it relate to that ditch at the east? And again, you know, what had happened to this in its later history? Moving on to the circular building. This intrigued us very much because it had a different form to other parts of the site. So we were instantly thinking, could this be an earlier structure? What was it used for? You know, could it be domestic or agricultural? Or could we be looking at some kind of shrine or temple? So, you know, obviously this was quite an interesting one for us to look at. And we're going to take a look at the excavated part of that now. So we've got a few pictures for you here of the sorts of things that we found in this trench. So essentially, we found that this was a circular structure with stone foundations and a diameter of 8.8 meters, which is a pretty good size for a roundhouse. Removal of part of the overlying rubble from inside that structure revealed a sort of packed earth floor and a few areas of scorching as well. So, you know, clearly an area of activity. There were sort of hints of internal features as well. I mean, in one area there was like a little wedge-shaped bit of stone that looked like it should be something, and that was quite close to a burnt area. So, you know, again, maybe some kind of hearth in there. There were other things about this circular building that are quite interesting, and that's really the two linear walls to the north. So I'll get my cursor again and start pointing. There we go. There's one there. There's actually one in there. We're looking at the same part here. So one there and one there. Now, these seem to be later additions. They seem to have been added during some kind of remodeling of the circular building. Now, they actually butt up to the structure rather than being keyed in. So that's good evidence for that. And the wall between them, I think you can probably see in this photograph here, is quite rubbly and ill-defined. So that is suggesting to us that that part of the structure may well have been demolished when the linear walls were added to create, you know, sort of different shaped building. The interesting thing about this as well is just how many finds that we had in this trench. It was very rich in pottery and bones, suggesting quite a lot of domestic activities. Early pottery dating suggests that we're looking at the 3rd century AD. So it's slightly earlier than the late 3rd to 4th century, which we have found in other trenches, but we're still looking at kind of later Roman rather than earlier Roman. So as yet, we're not really finding a lot of that earlier Roman activity, and you know, whether it is in different parts of the site, time may tell, but at the moment we really are kind of looking at this late period. There are also quite a lot of ashy deposits external to the building in this trench, and we took soil samples of those. The early results indicate that they are rich in cereal grains, including spelt wheat. So it certainly seems that there is domestic and an agricultural character to this building. Certainly we've seen no evidence for sort of funerary or religious activities. And in a way, although I don't think we got all the answers that we would have liked from this trench, it's very good to be able to kind of rule out some of the possible interpretations. We're going to head eastward now and have a look at that northern annex. Here it is. So what you're looking at is a photogrammetry plot of the entire trench. And you can see how well defined most of those walls are, with the exception of this one here. But we actually do think that that does continue. I've drawn a little line on it there so that you can see. So what we've really got is the northeastern corner of the building. And we can see quite a lot of subdivisions within that main structure. And some of them seem to create some quite small spaces. Now, these may even have been inserted at a later point as they butted up to the main walls rather than being keyed in. Intriguingly, we did not find any tessellated or mortar floors in the slots that we were able to excavate, and very little wall plaster was noted. So we're kind of looking at an area which seems to be quite sparsely decorated. We're not really kind of seeing the sort of luxury living that is hinted at in the Mosaic trench. Now, we haven't really got many domestic finds in this one either. So the place that they do crop up are in the ditch fill. So in a way, function has kind of eluded us a little bit with this particular structure. And whatever it was, I mean, maybe it was slave or servant quarters, storage, or even perhaps a part of the building was simply unfinished. But yes, it certainly does lack that kind of luxury character that we'll see in the main villa. I'm going to have a little look at this square structure now. So that's that little projecting bit to the north. Half of this was excavated. The wall appeared to be one continuous build, suggesting that it was originally freestanding, and it was only linked to the rest of the annex by a very short stretch of sort of infill walling, which didn't even seem to be bonded by mortar. Once again, we saw no sign of wall plaster or floors, but what we did find was an infant burial located outside the structure in the main ground. This north-south aligned burial was located roughly halfway along the wall, and it was below probably about 20 centimetres of made ground. What that does mean, though, that level was not fully exposed during the excavation. So although our slot was fortunate enough to locate this small burial, it may be that there are more, we don't know. So we didn't manage to investigate all around this structure. So it's certainly a very, very intriguing find. Infant burials are not uncommon in domestic Roman settings, and there are a number of theories about why this might be, from infanticide to foundation deposits to even trying to keep the infant close. I've no doubt that there'll be a lot of people who will have some interesting theories on this, and certainly when the bones are analysed, that might tell us a little more as well. Right, okay, so let's move on and have a look at the Mosaic trench. I've put a couple of pictures in here which are rather naughtily retrieved from a website, though I have referenced them, as you see. I put these in here because I think it's quite good to actually be able to visualize a little bit more. Sometimes when you're just looking at walls in the ground, it's quite hard to really understand what you're looking at. So we think that the Mosaic Room is probably the triclinium, a sort of dining room, which was, I believe, originally named for the 3 couches which occupied the apsidal end. The one that you're seeing in front of you is from Lullingstone, and in our villa site, the apse end is not quite so large, and we haven't got these dividing walls either. But I think it kind of gives you that sense of perhaps what this room might have been like, with your good old Roman folks lounging around at one end and perhaps receiving people or being fed or whatever, and certainly being able to view the mosaic. So again, here is a scale model of that's the Lullingstone one, and I put that in just because I wanted you to be able to kind of appreciate how such a room might fit into the larger plan of a villa. Let's have a look at ours though. So what we managed to achieve in this trench was to extend the trench over the full extent of the Mosaic Room, and we found that the apse was not semicircular, it was polygonal, and several parts of the wall were also exposed, and these indicated that there was more than one width of wall and possibly different construction techniques. Got a picture here of a little group of stones, and what that is a stone plinth. Now, we found these at every corner of the apse, so one here, here, and here. And it may well be that these are roof supports. So they possibly indicate quite an elaborate or even a vaulted roof over the apse. We didn't have many architectural fragments. We did have a couple of little bits of column. I really should have put the photo in where we actually stood that up on one of these plinths, because it was quite impressive. Whether it originally belonged there, who knows, but it certainly seemed to fit quite well. What we did find over the top of this room was rather a lot of diamond-shaped slates. These were the sort of local Collie Western type slate, and that many of them had nail holes, and sometimes the nail was actually still stuck in there. So they were using iron nails to keep these slates on. But there are also lesser quantities of ceramic tiles, so tegular and imbrex, suggesting that the villa roof was not actually all the same. You know, you had actually got different types of roofing materials on there, and hopefully that will be something that we'll be able to look at in a little bit more detail once all the finds are examined. Now, we wanted to look at the immediate surroundings of the mosaic, which led to the exploration of areas to the east, south, and west of it. So we actually identified more tessellated pavements on the east and south sides. So the example on the east, which you can see in this picture here, was patterned. Now, our mosaic expert, David Neal, thinks it very likely that this pattern, this sort of, I don't know what you call that really, it's almost like almost like a little flower shape, isn't it, or a little star or something. And anyway, he believes that that is likely to have been repeated across the whole of the room. So not figurative, but something quite different to what we see in the main mosaic room. The example on the south, well, as much as we had managed to expose it anyway, appears to be plain. So what you're seeing here is a photogrammetry image of, that's the wall of the mosaic room. That's that wall there. And then you've got this rather plain floor. I mean, I suppose it is possible that we are just looking at the border, but I think it would be quite a wide border if that were the case. Now, there are hints that there were several phases of activity in this area. So possibly an earlier wall. The one I'm thinking of is this one here. I can't prove it, but I do sort of have some kind of suspicions that it may originally have actually run across here, and that the mosaic room itself may have been a later addition. You know, hopefully we'll be able to shed more light on that as we go through the post-excavation analysis. Now, the other thing that suggests that there is more than one phase was, and you won't be able to see it from on this plan very well, but there was actually subsidence in the mosaic, sort of slight slumping on that sort of northwest, southeast kind of axis there, suggesting that there may well have been a buried earlier feature underneath the room, you know, perhaps a ditch or something like that. We didn't find much pottery, much domestic pottery in this room either, but the dates that we have so far, bear in mind that's only based on a very small sample that's been looked at. It's actually late 3rd to 4th century. So, you know, as I was saying earlier, slightly later than the circular building trench, but again, just very much in that late period. Okay, let's move on. Okay, so I did a little field trip to Chedworth Roman Villa the other weekend. Can't stay away from them now, it seems. And I found this structure here, which I thought was rather reminded me of something we'd found on the site. So this is on the western side of the mosaic. There was like a large rubble-filled area. And there were some fragments of box flue in there, and also lots of fragments of a rather broken up mosaic, which had been laid on a thick bed of mortar. So presumably thick enough so that it would be able to sit above a HyperCoursed system. So I'm wondering if what we've got here, and I think Pete suggested it at the time, might be some kind of stoke hole. I've noted there that that's unexcavated, because I don't want you to go thinking that this is actually a solid wall and we've got a T-shaped structure there. It looks like this may continue. So this is where our sort of putative HyperCoursed masonry is. So we've got stone sides of the channel, which you can see has scorched this rather lovely shade of pink, and there is lots of heavily sooted residue in the bottom there. I mean, of course, we're only looking at small parts here. We weren't able to remove all of the rubble over the top, and some of it, in fact, to expose these two bits here, we actually did that right at the end of the site just before backfilling. So that was done with machine, but it certainly rewarded us by giving us these stone blocks with hints of a channel between. So what it's suggesting is that this may well be some kind of channeled HyperCoursed, which is something that is, I believe, you know, one of the later forms of HyperCoursed. And the fact that we've got this broken up mosaic floor, which presumably had been above it, really does kind of point to that conclusion. But there's a lot more work really that it would be nice to do on this area. There's quite a lot that we don't fully understand. I mean, hoping the analysis will shed a bit more light on it, but yeah, it's certainly a very great find, because it is suggesting that at least this part of the building was heated anyway. Okay, so I think it's really time now for us to move on and actually, you know, take a break from the structural archaeology and start thinking about some art instead, and some culture. So the most anticipated part of the 2021 project was associated with this objective, and that was to uncover the portion of mosaic floor previously exposed during trenching in 2020 and extend this to the hitherto unseen parts of the mosaic. Well, I'm pleased to report that we actually did manage to complete that objective. So the entire mosaic was revealed and recorded. Now, the mosaic was damaged and scorched in a number of places, as you can see on this photogrammetry image on the right here. But we did manage to identify further figures, so more than this is that piece that we looked at last year, and yes, as you can see, we've enlarged it considerably. So I think we've really got enough now to enable the story to be told, and certainly to get that decorative scheme recorded. The apse itself, with the much anticipated apse, I should say, was plain. There'd been two chances really, you know, either there would have been a nice figure in the apse, or there wouldn't have been, and as it happens there wasn't. But in a way, I think that kind of adds to the interpretation, because this really does look like an area that, you know, wasn't considered quite as important. You could put your furniture on there and you could still view the rather lovely panels from that end. There's a slightly intriguing little patch of possible decoration or repair, something down here, something again which seems a little bit out of place. Yeah, it may well be a repair, but at the moment we don't fully know. What strikes me about the mosaic really, and you're probably going to get some of my kind of personal opinions here. There are plenty of people that are a lot more qualified than I am to talk about the mosaic, but these are my impressions of it. It's very carefully and neatly composed, and also in my view it's not overdone. There's not sort of too much detail, too much overwhelming detail, and there's also all these, you know, rather lovely features to it, as you'll see as we start to look at those panels, where you've got the overlapping of the figures onto the border itself. So it really makes them stand out. You know, it's actually, I found that the more I look at it, the more I enjoy looking at it. Actually, it's sort of, it's got a, on first glance I think it looks almost crude and cartoonish, but the more you look at it, the more it really does have a kind of quite special charm, I think. So the mosaic pavement is set into a surround of large grey tesserae, and it's framed by 4-strand guilloche, which is a fancy word meaning a sort of braided, plaited pattern. And they are outlined in dark grey and they are shaded red and white. It's then divided into 3 rectangular panels. They're sort of in landscape orientation, and they're divided by some simple guilloche in the same colours, except that they're outlined in blue. A panel filled with guilloche mat, so that's this here, guilloche mat, and that separates the figurative scenes from the acts. Now, each panel tells part of a story, and that story is set near the end of the siege of Troy, based on Homer's Illiad, which was written about 800 BCE, I think. This is the first mosaic in Roman Britain to depict scenes from the Trojan War. And here, the story alluded to is a battle between the Greek sort of superhero, really, Achilles, and Hector, Prince of Troy. Now, this is where it all gets a little bit soapy. So the background to this episode is that Patroclus, Achilles' close friend and ally, had gone into battle wearing Achilles' armour. Now, the reason he'd done this is because Achilles was refusing to fight and sulking in his trench, and Patroclus wanted to inspire the Greek troops to fight the Trojans. But unfortunately, during this episode, he was killed by Hector, and Achilles is grief-stricken and completely enraged and seeks revenge. Now, Achilles is a popular figure to put on a mosaic, and he does appear on several others in Roman Britain. I think there's an example at Keynsham, Somerset, and Rudge in Wiltshire, and he possibly also appears on a mosaic from Hawkstow in Lincolnshire. Let's go on to look at some of the detail. So hopefully you can see that okay. What we're looking at there is, well, quite frankly, it's a pretty high octane scene. So we've got 2 figures armed with spears and carrying shields, driving 2-horse chariots and racing towards each other at some speed. So the horses of the chariot on the right are both light coloured with red harnesses, bridles and reins, and they're smaller than the horses confronting them. Now, one of these horses is light and the other is dark, and their harnesses are really quite elaborate in comparison, with kind of jewelled sort of red and white edges. There are curved lines which are under their bodies that you can see here, and we sort of debated a little bit about what these might be. They could be shadows, they could be well, I mean, I like the idea of them being the mud thrown up under the horse's hooves, you know, showing the kind of speed and you know, giving the scene quite a dynamic quality. So what this represents then is the duel between Hector and Achilles, which is normally described as being on foot rather than from chariots. We'll come back to that later on. The light and dark horses are likely to belong to Achilles. So these are actually the immortal horses, Xanthos meaning bay, and I think Balius meaning dappled, who were a wedding gift to Achilles' parents from Poseidon. So yeah, some wedding there. But anyway, these horses actually play quite a big part in many of the stories. Now, Achilles on the left there is a large, bold and dramatic figure. He is, I believe they call it, heroically naked. He is rippling with muscles and seems to be in some kind of deep lunge. So it certainly looks like Hector on the other side is slightly compressed into the right side of the panel. He's got his back to the viewer. He holds his shield in his left hand, and he's got his spear or javelin in his right. And he's also, you know, he's wearing a tunic. So there we go. I mean, of the two, sort of, it certainly looks like Achilles is going to get the upper hand. Just thought I'd show you a nice detail of the 2 sets of horses. And I really like the way their legs are here. I really like the way you can see them kind of really really prancing at each other. It's great, but again, you can see there's something a little more lively about these horses. Yes, they do almost have sort of a human look in their eye. I mean, I'm imagining that, probably been looking at it too long. Let's move on to panel 2. Okay, so what happens here then? Well, the battle's over, but frankly, the scene is no less dramatic. So we've got it's the panel being outlined in a single grey or blue line of tessera there, and outside of that are 2 rows of a sort of yellowy colour. Now, a large red shield and a spear are held by the figure in the chariot. Unfortunately, only the arm, hopefully you can see that there, and parts of the legs and torso are actually still surviving. This, however, is Achilles' chariot. You can tell because it's drawn by the light and the dark horses, and they are galloping towards the right-hand side of the panel. The chariot is dragging the inverted body of Hector. His eyes are closed, so you'll notice there all the other figures have got very bright white eyes, but his eyes are closed in death. And he's got these little bits of, these little strips of sort of red tesserae on him, which may indicate the wounds and abrasions that he has suffered. Because basically the poor lad is being, his body is being dragged around Troy for several days, I believe, in the Iliad. Now, Achilles also seems to be holding this pink-rimmed shield here, and that was the one that Hector had in the previous panel. So this may well indicate Achilles taking back his armour, which Hector had seized during his victorious battle with Patroclus. Now, behind the chariot, a shield-bearing figure wearing a tunic, this chap here, is seeming to wave his arms in celebration, so he's obviously fairly happy about the way the thing went. I think this side of the panel is particularly dramatic as well. You've got a bearded figure in a long stripy blue tunic and wearing this rather lovely Phrygian hat that marks him out as a Trojan. Now, he is barefoot and his arms are outstretched. And there is a certain motion, I think, to that figure. He may well be running towards those horses. He is pleading for the return of his son's body. Now, below him and just to his right, we've got these 3-pronged tails of 2 sea creatures. There's a little face here too, which I will show you in more detail in just a moment. These undoubtedly signify something important. They might just be suggesting that this is a coastal location, or they could be referring to the fact that these horses were a gift from Poseidon. So let's have a closer look. There's our horses again. That's the head of Priam, king of Troy. And that's a detail of poor dead Hector, as we often refer to him on site. But, it's quite a powerful image, really, that one. And everybody's favourite, little sea monster there. You can just see that it's got its mouth open, it's got some kind of ears or antennae there, and is that fire or is that a tongue sticking out? Who knows? But it's such a shame that we've actually lost a lot of that detail. Okay, let's move on to the third panel now. So it's a much calmer scene, but I think no less striking. We've again got the same type of border as we had with the second panel. And the central figure is this chap here with the scales. So he's got sort of red leggings on, sandals, I believe, and a purple tunic. And he is holding a pan on either side, into which on this side we're getting some gold, which will be deposited by Priam. And on this side we have the body of Hector. So in this version then, Priam has begged Achilles to release his son Hector's body, and it is agreed to match his weight in gold. Now, yeah, we know this is Priam because he is dressed identically to in the previous panel. But behind him is this rather curious figure here. So he's holding a shield, but you'll notice he doesn't actually seem to have any legs. So we're not quite sure what happened here. Is this some kind of mistake, or is it actually something that's meant to be like that? Now, it's really unfortunate, but this left side of the panel is very badly scorched. We've also got some missing parts of the mosaic in here as well. We can see this figure in the top, who is wearing a tunic, and he may be the same character as the shield bearer in the panel below. He could be Diomedes, who's a sort of second Achilles in the Iliad. Achilles himself is quite hard to see, but once you notice his eyes and hair, it becomes easier. So if I just get my cursor there, you see we've got an eye there, and that's his hair. So you might just there be able to make out his leg coming down here. So a little bit of detail of the man holding the scales, and there we have a little bit of detail from the right hand side. I have done a little bit of work using the close-up photographs that we've taken, and I've been able to trace some of the faded lines in the scorched area. So I'm going to show you what I think I can see in here. So let's just put that on. I massively bumped up the saturation of this image as well, so that's why the colours are kind of really popping out. But I did that so that I could really kind of try and see what was going on. It just helped me a little bit. So this is what I think I can see, and I'm fairly pleased, well, fairly satisfied that I haven't made any of these lines up, that they're sort of dictated by how the mosaic has been laid. So it does look like we've got Achilles almost sitting in a kind of splendor there, surrounded by various bits of weaponry and armor, with this chap behind him. He's sat on something, but we don't really know what that is yet. And he's got one leg which is stretched out, that's his foot there, and the other one which seems to be bent at the knee. Now, this here, it looks like it may be another figure, but it has also been suggested that this might actually not be a figure but be a helmet and part of the armour. So I don't know, that's for people other than me to debate, but certainly really, really interesting. So what's the significance of all this then? So we've got this tale of ancient Troy, which has actually come quite a long way to Rutland. So it just kind of shows the long reach of these stories. The only other place we know of that shows the same scene is a late 4th century mosaic from the villa at Telaro in Sicily. And that's the image here. So you can see it's a totally different style, an awful lot more going on. But what's really interesting about this is that it diverges in the same way from the Iliad as our mosaic. So in the Iliad, Hector vows not to return, Achilles vows not to return Hector's body, even for his weight in gold. So where have the scales come from? Now, Jane Massilia and David Neal have pointed out that a 5th century playwright, Aeschylus, I hope I have said that right, in his now mostly lost play, The Phrygians, has introduced scales in that play where the corpse is balanced against his weight in gold. And the story of the scales also occurs in something called the Excidium Troiae, a medieval manuscript which was collected by Richard Rawlinson in the early 17th century and is now in the Bodleian Library. And that may have been based on a much earlier Latin text. So whether the scene here is illustrating Aeschylus or a postulated Latin version, or has come from some other source, it's quite debatable. But it does show that whoever commissioned the mosaic was not only very rich, but also wanted to display their knowledge of the classics. So the scenes may have been based on an illustration from a codex, which maybe the villa owner even had, or it could even be some kind of pattern book. Again, there's lots of things to debate here. There's so much detail that we haven't really been able to discuss yet, and so much symbolism, I think, in this mosaic that we're probably yet to understand. But I think what really does come across is that what was important to the owner was sort of showing this thrilling tale of heroes, of combat, victory and defeat, grief, revenge, fate and death. I mean, that's, you know, powerful stuff to have in your dining room. So the final part of my talk is about what happened afterwards. So we're now coming to the kind of fate of the villa, if you like. So yes, rather flippantly called the wandering fireplaces here, but we've got lots of evidence that the mosaic room was used differently in its later history. So we've got areas of burning on top of the main floor, which suggest a sequence of halves starting in the southeast corner. So that's this thing here, where we actually seem to have had a hearth which was built into the mosaic room while the floor was still clear and visible. Stone blocks, as you can see, were built against the wall, and there's a circular area of scorching. You might be able to see better in this photogrammetry image here. So this kind of shows the extent of it, and there's a very cracked and burnt area in the centre, which really kind of shows where the heat was most intense. And I think the careful positioning definitely shows that the floor was still in good condition at the time. But evidently this was, you know, this was a form of heating for this room that was considered necessary. Now, later on, things start to get a little bit more messy. We find areas of intense scorching and heat damage across the mosaic, which indicate multiple halves and certainly multiple areas of burning activity, you know, sort of things that have actually come into contact with that floor and scorched it directly. So what you can see here with this purple patterning across the plan of the room, so that's really the kind of shape of all of that scorching. So these lighter purple parts are the just where it's been slightly scorched, and these are really kind of deeply burnt areas. So I think you can see here, I've just shown you what this scorching looks like on the mosaic itself. Now, at some point, the room was also filled with rubble. This appears to have been sorted in some way, because we didn't find an awful lot of neatly shaped blocks or architectural fragments. We also found some fragments of quernstone in the rubble, which is not exactly what you'd expect to see in a fine dining room. So it may well have been that the villa was robbed and that stone sorted, and the stuff that was wanted elsewhere was taken away and the rest packed in, or just left there anyway. We did find another circular half identified in the centre of the room. Now, it's quite difficult to decide when this actually occurred, because it was partly within the rubble and disuse layers, but it seems that it might well represent more than one phase of hearth within broadly the same location, because a lower hearth that we saw in the 2020 excavation is in a ever slightly different place. So yes, it is interesting, because it does seem to be dead centre in that room, which again is sort of suggesting that the walls were still visible. So yeah, there's quite a lot happening in this later period. As mentioned, we have definitely seen quite a bit of robbing over the area, and a bit of destruction as well. So the main area where we saw a lot of this broken up material was in this part here on the west side, so overlying our flue system, which of course, you know, once that floor was gone, would have provided a nice hollow for throwing away all the bits you didn't want. So we found lots of these bits of broken up mosaic, different pattern to what we had in the main mosaic room, and I think, as I mentioned earlier, on very thick bits of mortar, and also quite a lot of wall plaster too. So those they were coming in various colours. So I think that we should be able to get quite a few clues as to the decoration of the villa from that, which is brilliant. You have to wonder whether this was deliberately backfilled for some reason, and I think, well, you'll probably see why I said that when we come to the next slide. So this was a fairly unexpected discovery and found quite early on. We found a grave which was actually sitting under the plough soil but on top of the rubble, which contained at least 2 flexed burials. So one appeared to be laid directly behind the other, spooning, as the students on site told me. So it's kind of broadly orientated east-west, and really importantly, it's centred within the apse. I mean, that's got to be significant, hasn't it? It implies that the walls of the building were certainly still visible at the time that this burial took place. No, it's quite likely the roof wasn't on, but certainly the shape of the building is likely to be there. And that's not the only evidence either. We found some disarticulated and disturbed bones. So they could be from burials that were disturbed later on. You know, perhaps they were buried less deeply, and you know, ploughing over many generations has actually disturbed those. Unfortunately, we don't yet have a date for these burials. It's very, very tempting to think they might be Saxon. I mean, certainly Saxon graves in Roman sites are well known. I believe that there were some Middle Saxon graves at the Empingham Villa nearby. So yes, a really intriguing and you know, exciting find, and certainly we should be able to find out much more about those as the post-excavation analysis goes on. And that activity was not confined to the area around the Mosaic Room either. If we remember back to our north annex, what we did find there was, again, the rooms appeared to have been filled with the rubble. There was a lot more rubble inside the building than outside the building. And we also found quite a few areas where there were human and animal bones within the rubble layers inside the building. So most spectacularly was this rather lovely large dog, which is actually buried in the square structure. It's actually sitting there on top of the rubble, has gone in intact, looking at it, and that will hopefully be able to tell us a lot more once we're able to analyse it. We also found some human foot bones. You may not be able to make these out very well, but there's some little bones in there. They might actually signify that we have a burial sort of extending outside the area of our trench. If it is a burial, if those are the foot bones, it's difficult to say which way it's going, but could be north-south, difficult to say. And there are other things like this group of bones that were located within the rubble in the building as well. These ones are animal bones, not human, but, you know, really we've got these, you know, these deliberate deposits. Again, the dating is currently unknown, but it would be so good to include them in a programme of C14 from the site, which I'm sure that we will be doing, and, you know, really kind of watch this space. That does sort of bring me to the end in a way, but it's only the end of the introduction really. There's so much more to find out. So you know, we know that mosaic and classical scholars are going to pore over the detail of the mosaic, and they'll find lots of new interpretations for these details and what they mean. You know, I'm quite sure that it is full of symbolism. All the characters are going to be named people in the story, so every bit of detail probably has a meaning, and you know, I look forward to hearing what people think. But of course, it's not all about the mosaic. The finds and soil samples will be analysed and provide information on trades, activities and chronology of the villa. And careful study of the order of the structures and deposits laid down at the site will give us insights into how it was constructed, how it was used, and how it fell into disrepair. And of course, there are other examples, lots of other sites that, you know, we can compare our site with and help us understand those details. And I think, as Pete said right at the beginning, further excavation will take place next year, although the details are yet to be decided. But whatever we do, it's going to provide new information that may modify, support, or explain what we're thinking already. And it's just really, really, really exciting. I'm just going to finish off with, here we are, the mosaic being very skillfully backfilled there with lots of sand to protect it, and then lots of stones going down on top. And here also are a few more images from our excavation, and I think I do like this picture here because the smile on our student Christoph's face kind of says it all there. You know, he's just been discovering these wonderful things on the mosaic, and yes, it's been a really interesting and a lovely collaborative excavation. So there we go. I think it just remains me to thank you very much for listening to me for so long, and to also thank all my colleagues for helping us to get to this point. I've tried to remember as many people as possible because, as I said at the beginning, it's a team effort. You know, it's about a lot of people. So many people have done so much to really aid this excavation, and I'm just lucky enough to be presenting it, really. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much, Jan. That was fabulous. I've got a whole page of questions.
Oh no!
That have come in while the talk's been going on. I mean, as you've made clear, there's a lot more work to do on this. It's yes. Very early days because the excavation only finished at the end of September. None of the analysis really has got to a satisfactory stage so far, and couldn't, however hard people work. So there's a lot of things that are questions that we can't answer yet. But if I just go through the ones that we've got, hopefully a lot of them will be fairly quick. Joe asked, the first question we had in was, how deep can magnetometry work?
Oh, how deep? That's a very good question, and I'm probably not best qualified to answer that one, really. I think I'm going to be a little bit circumspect and say it depends on the geology, which is quite a nice kind of cop-out. But I suppose the real answer to that would be to ask a geophysicist. But I think it does vary from site to site. So yeah, I'm sure somebody if somebody else would have a better answer to that.
I mean, the good thing about sites like this is that it's really just under the plough soil.
Well, there is that.
It doesn't have to go that deep.
It doesn't have to go 10 meters down, does it? So no. So let's say it's probably within the top meter or so.
Right. Joanne Warren asked, did we know about the site before? And the answer, I think, is no.
No.
Quite simply, isn't it?
No. All new and exciting.
Yeah. Rosie asked, why was the site so well preserved? Has it been pasture? And I think I can probably answer this. In that there was no sign of ridge and furrow that you would get in most sites in Leicestershire and Rutland, suggesting to me at least that we are in the sort of common pasture land on the edge of the parish that this sits within. So I don't think it was ploughed in the medieval period, and of course it's probably only in the last sort of 30 or 40 years that any ploughing will have happened on the site, is my guess. But I don't know whether you agree with that, Jen.
Well, I certainly agree with the fact that we saw no sign of ridge and furrow. Yes, I would also agree. Yes, it is well preserved, but another thing about archaeology is that sites, they're built up and they kind of erode. So I think we've been very lucky to catch this one, because yes, it really was just under the plough soil. So I think if it had waited a few more years, we may well not have the good preservation that we've got now.
Yes, absolutely. Erica asked, any comments about why the circular structure had partly herringbone and partly tabular construction?
Well, the herringbone seemed to be turning up on the inside of the structure, so it might be something like that. But we also saw it on the inside of the Mosaic Room as well. To be honest, that is something that intrigues me as well, but it's something that I will be needing to look into, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Right, Miles Lockwood asked, do typical villa layouts give any clue to the function of the northern annex?
They do, don't they? And I'm going to turn that over to you, Pete, because you've you know quite a thing or two about villas, but yes, they do. Go, Pete.
I'm not sure I know the answer to this.
Well, I was reading something earlier about the sort of form of rooms, and certainly with that type of reception room that is found towards the back of the building. So if we're assuming that the villa might be south facing, it is kind of it's almost, the rooms are sort of leading up to it. So I wonder if that's something to do with it.
Yeah, possibly. It's yeah, I'm not sure I can add anything.
We have some easy questions now, please.
Ian Efron asked if pollen analysis gives any idea of the landscape. Well, we haven't got any, I think, is the answer, isn't it, at this stage? I mean, maybe in future excavations we might get deposits that give us some pollen, but not at the moment.
Yeah, most of our deposits are very shallow and very dry, so yeah, you don't get preservation of everything.
Miles Lockwood, coming around again, asked, how does the artistic quality of the mosaic compare to mosaics in the rest of the empire and in Britain?
That's a good one, isn't it? Yeah. Well, I mean, I think you saw the mosaic in Sicily, which is sort of a very, very different style. I mean, the ones we get here don't seem to be a sort of less naturalistic style, I think. Again, I'm not a mosaic expert, so I'm not really best placed to answer that sort of question. But what I can tell you is that David Neal, who knows rather a lot about mosaics, has been very impressed by the quality of this one. And yes, he's been very, very keen on it indeed, and thinks it's of extremely high quality.
Yes, but I think if you see mosaics in sort of North Africa and around the Med, they do, to my mind, look better than anything you see in Britain. But there you go. But in terms of British mosaics, it is first rate, really, isn't it?
Yes, I think that's sort of what I was trying to say. Not very well.
Mary asked, are the colours vibrant or faded?
Well, that's also something which changes, because basically when the mosaic is damp, the colours stand out. They are really vibrant. If say the sky is overcast and the mosaic's damp, then you're really looking at quite a kaleidoscope of colour. It's lovely. But then, by contrast, once that sun has dried out the mosaic, it becomes very, very faded. and the colours do kind of fade and become all a bit beigey. But it's interesting you should ask that, because when I was at Chedworth the other week, I was looking at theirs, and I looked at the photos, which were bright and vibrant and full of colour, and then I looked at down at the floor, which was looking a little bit dry and dusty, and yeah, again you could see that same thing happening there.
Yeah, I think it's inevitable, isn't it? So I'm trying to write down questions while listening to you, Jen. Sorry, just finish that one. Ian Birrell asked about the damage to the mosaic, and what happens to the tesserae, particularly with the burning and things. Why have we got such big patches? I think was the paraphrasing the question, which I didn't write all of it down.
Oh. So why have we got such big patches of damage?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that really is just down to its later history. I mean, I think, it certainly shows that in its later life, it was not treated incredibly well. And what we do know is that each little cube is sort of held together by all the other little cubes around it. That's really, it has a kind of integrity. So if one little bit starts to go, then the rest of it almost frays at the edges. I mean, that's why when we were working on it, we had to be so careful not to tread on those edges, because if you did, you'd be making that hole bigger. So I think that's probably really the answer, that once it loses structural integrity in a place, then that damage will widen very easily. Yeah,
and the fire just sort of lifts the tesserae off the bedding, doesn't it?
Yes.
Right. Brian Godfrey asks, how is the site being protected?
Armed guards, and no, it's not. Well, it might be watchtowers. No, the site is basically being protected by being completely covered up. So there's nothing visible on the surface at all.
And it has legal protection in that it's scheduled as an ancient monument, isn't it? Yes.
Legal protection as of a couple of weeks ago. So yes. So
which is why this talk had to go back 2 weeks, because the scheduling was later than originally we were told it would be. Caroline McKenzie asked about are there any names or inscriptions or anything giving an idea of who might have owned the villa, and I think the answer is not yet.
No, sadly, no.
Yeah.
That's Lullingstone, isn't it, Caroline? Yes.
Yes.
Yes, I had a look at your blog earlier. It was very
good. So Joe asked, is proximity to Ermine Street relevant to the site?
Yes, so you've got to get there, haven't you? Got to get there, but there must have been minor roads as well.
Yes, yeah. Rosie asked, was the mosaic laid by local mosaicists or?
Well, yeah, that's a very difficult one to answer. There's lots of different thoughts about this sort of thing. There's the whole sort of travelling band of mosaicists, going around the country laying mosaics. But I suppose what we do know is that whoever did it was highly skilled. Perhaps not so much the border. That could well have been done by local person down the road who perhaps didn't do mosaics all the time, but certainly the the figurative panels themselves have been very carefully done.
Digger Bright asked, are the burnt areas to do with the destruction of the building or the sort of so-called squatter occupation?
Well, that's a question to be considered. I'm not sure we've got, you know, sort of enough burning to suggest the building burnt down. I'm not sure we've got that sort of evidence. So it's probably something that is more associated with activities taking place on the site afterwards. I would think that would be my best guess at the moment. But, you know, as I say, a lot of these things are going to be subject to change as more evidence comes in.
And then the next question about radiocarbon dating of the carbon from those deposits. I mean, obviously that hasn't happened yet, but
it has not happened yet, but it will happen. Yes.
But that could well give us a date that will
Yes.
give us some sort of idea of what is going on, and the analysis of the deposits there could give an idea of why they're doing it and what the burning is about.
Yes.
Hopefully. Paul Fountain asks, are the photogrammetry models published anywhere, and are they going to be?
That might be a question for Matthew, actually, possibly, but I'm not. I think the photogrammetry, the stills from the photogrammetry models are pretty much everywhere, I think now, but I'm quite sure that the models, that we can do that if we haven't done it already. So it's, yeah, that's something we can look into.
We can definitely do it and make them available via Sketchfab.
Perfect. Thanks, Matthew.
Yeah.
Don't like to release everything all in one go.
Well, no, there is that. We won't have anything left, will we?
But yeah, it's something we can definitely look into and make available.
Yeah.
Miles Lockwood again, who did say, sorry for asking so many questions. Were the graves east-west?
No, well, one was, the one with the 2 burials was. Actually, yes, thinking about it, both of the proper graves that we've had on the site have been, yeah.
Right. Somebody whose name I didn't write down asked a question about funding for future excavations.
Are they volunteering?
I don't think so.
We have a card machine.
But I mean, as I understand it, the future excavations are going to be Historic England led.
That's right.
And hopefully they will be able to provide the funding or access the funding at least. But I don't think it's something that you're involved with, is it? And
no, I mean, that's all kind of under discussion at the moment, but yes, they will be providing the funding, yeah, for any work that they do next year.
Yeah. There were several people, Stephen Greet, George Keeping and Simon Chenery, all asked about other finds from the site.
Right.
Yeah, and whether, Stephen in particular asked, you know, if they give the same indication of status as the mosaic does.
Well, that's not really something that we unfortunately have enough detail on at the moment. You see, it's such early days that a lot of the finds haven't even been through the processing system yet, so let alone actually being looked at. So I think that's a question probably for another talk in a few months' time.
Right. I'm sure I've missed some questions there. We've got now to 9 o'clock, and I think probably we've exhausted the bulk of the questions.
There's one key question that's cropped up a couple of times, and that is, what are the long-range plans for the site? And are there any plans to lift the mosaic? That's popped up a couple of times.
Yeah, that's a question I was sort of expecting would come up, and I can say at the moment there are no plans to lift the mosaic. I mean, it's a large area, it's a very expensive thing to do, and then you've got to have a proper building to house it in. But again, it's still early days with this site, and I think that at the moment the biggest long range plan is actually just to protect it. I mean, the site is not going to be in cultivation any longer, so that will basically put a stop to any damage occurring that may have been exacerbated by ploughing. So that's probably the main answer, really. And I think Historic England are going to do some work next year, and probably on the basis of that, some further longer range plans will be made. I'm sorry I can't answer all your questions. There's a lot of sort of ifs and buts and maybes at the moment, but as I say, it's very, very new, so there's a lot of things that still need to be worked out. Right,
well, thank you very much for answering all the questions you could, Jen. It's a fantastic talk. Obviously a fantastic site, which makes it easier to do a fantastic talk about it.
Yeah, it talks itself.
But I think, at such an early stage after the excavations are finished, I think you've managed to answer a whole lot of questions. I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out next on the site, and what comes out of the post-ex work on the site. But I'm sure you'll probably not have the chance to look at the chat box at all, but an awful lot of people saying what a fantastic talk it's been.
Oh, thank you, that's really kind.
And I would just echo that. I think it's been fabulous, look forward really to hearing the next instalment and perhaps we'll get you back to come and talk when we know a bit more about the site.
Yeah, Rutland Villa, the return.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this could be a series. I mean, it's a franchise. But no, it has been absolutely fabulous, so thank you very, very much.